We're going to go ahead and get started. So I would like to welcome everyone to the Better Call Trawl Challenge webinar. We are really excited to have you here today and to talk through a little bit more about the Better Call Trawl Challenge. In just a moment, I'll pass it over to our colleagues at BOEM to go through a presentation on the challenge, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. If you have any questions, you can drop them into the Q&A chat box at the bottom of your screen. For introductions, my name is Kyla Jeffrey. I'm the VP of Customer Success at HeroX and really happy to be here to be supporting this challenge. Also on this team, I have the BOEM folks. So Jake, I'll pass it over to you for an introduction, and then to Doug, and you can take it away with the presentation.
Sure, so I'm good. Okay, hi everybody. I'm Jake Levinson. I am a marine biologist in BOEM's Environmental Studies Division. My job is to ensure we have the science that we need to support the decisions that we need to make, whether it's about mining sand or energy or anything like that. And I get to work with some of my great colleagues like my pal Doug here. Doug?
Everybody, thanks, Jake. My name is Doug Piatkowski. I'm also at the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, specifically within our marine minerals program. And so my job at the Bureau is to analyze the potential impacts of various activities in the ocean, specifically in terms of our marine minerals program. It would be looking at the impacts of offshore dredging. And so this study is particularly important to the work that I do. And I'm excited to kind of share with you some more background information and a little more details on the scope of this work. And we're excited to see what kind of ideas those folks who are out there can share with us. So with that said, Kyla, if it's okay, I'll go ahead and get started with the presentation with the next slide. For at least today's talk, I wanted to kind of start with just where BOEM is. I realize that there's going to be a lot of people from all over the world potentially participating in this challenge. And so from the standpoint of kind of this presentation, I'm going to start with just a couple slides, just getting everybody familiar with BOEM and what particular program in BOEM this research will be, or this work will be helping. And then get into the details in terms of the particular activities, specifically dredging and trawling, and the relationship of those activities to potential sea turtle impacts, and then leading towards the scope of this particular challenge. And so just to begin with this particular slide, BOEM, or the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, is a bureau within the Department of Interior in the United States. And we are specifically responsible for managing and facilitating access to energy resources and minerals in the US Outer Continental Shelf. As you can see in this slide, there's kind of three overarching mission responsibilities for the Bureau, including both oil and gas, marine minerals, and renewable energy. Specifically for the sake of today's discussion, we're going to be focusing just on the Bureau's marine minerals program and our specific activities in terms of authorizing use of offshore sediment for beach nourishment projects, and I will clarify specifically what that is in the next few slides. I just want to make one quick note on this slide. I'm not providing a lot of detail on these program areas, but I do have a link at the bottom of this slide that would bring you to both BOEM's website as well as our marine minerals program, where you can find a lot more detail about our program. Next slide. So specifically within our marine minerals program, what is it that we do? So our primary mission responsibility is to facilitate access to and manage the Outer Continental Shelf sediment resources. And we do that in a manner that is I guess, friendly with the environment in terms of our environmental stewardship responsibility. And so we in the Bureau, in terms of this mission, we are authorizing the use of sediment located in the Outer Continental Shelf, primarily for the purpose of extracting that sediment and putting it on beaches throughout the Atlantic and Gulf of Mexico coast of the United States. And so specifically, as I note in this slide, it's either to replenish beaches, to reduce potential impacts to homes or structures, but also to restore habitat for various wildlife. Next slide, please. And so I've introduced kind of the Bureau, and then specifically our Marine Minerals Program. And so in terms of what exactly we're doing in the Marine Minerals Program, as you may have seen in the news or experienced in various other parts of the world, with climate change and sea level rise and increased storm frequencies, the amount of erosion that we're seeing and potential impacts to coastal development and habitat continues to increase. And so I thought this was a compelling slide. This is a video image of the recent hurricane that we experienced in the US on the southwest coast of Florida, Hurricane Ian. And then this picture on the right is a house in the Outer Banks of the United States in North Carolina that was in a movie called Nights in Rodanthe. This home has since been picked up and moved, but definitely representative of some of the challenges we're seeing on the coast in the US in terms of structures falling into the ocean or moving, and again, emphasizing the importance of having a resilient coast in adapting to this increased challenge of coastal erosion and sea level rise. Next slide, please. And so in terms of what we're doing to mitigate this risk, for the last 100 years in the US, we've been executing beach nourishment projects. This graphic on the left shows you this trend from 1923 to today in terms of the amount of sediment that has been placed on beaches throughout the country. And specifically this, in terms of BOEM's role, we are authorizing the use of sand offshore that can be extracted by a dredge and then placed on the beach, again, to nourish these beaches for the purpose of reducing damage to structures on the beach or to restore habitat that's been eroded. And so I wanted to just kind of emphasize in this slide that this is a continued trend in terms of an approach that we're taking to reduce these potential risks on the coast in the US. Next slide, please.
Doug, can I interrupt you for a second? So can we talk about what you mean by nourish? We're basically sucking up sand and putting it on the beach, right?
That's right. And so for these two pictures here, I want to emphasize, and I'll get to the specifics of the dredge types in a minute and how this all happens, but basically these vessels are extracting sediment offshore, anywhere from 1 to 3+ miles offshore, and they are pumping it to the beach and building out these beaches. So the graphic on the picture on the upper right is an example of a vessel that is pumping that sediment to the beach. And then the bottom picture is showing you what that beach looks like after it's been built out. So this is essentially the concept of beach nourishment, taking sediment from one place, putting it on the beach and building out a certain width and height of that beach for the purpose of reduction of damage to homes or habitat restoration.
Gotcha. So making beaches nice.
Pretty much.
Got it.
Next slide, please. So I think it's important as we kind of look through the content related to this challenge in particular, it's important to kind of understand the operation of dredging and then how that relates to trawling, sea turtle relocation trawling, and then ultimately to the specific challenge we're proposing here, which is what is the effectiveness of that particular effort, relocation trawling. So I wanted to set the stage, at least through this webinar, for kind of how we even got to where we are, because a lot of this kind of background context isn't captured in the challenge guidelines, and I think it's definitely relevant. So as Jake asked that question, what is beach nourishment? And I mentioned it's in short, we're basically removing sediment from one location offshore and via all these different suites of construction activities, we're moving that sediment to the beach and building a wide beach. So this picture on the left, what I should mention that for these types of dredging activities offshore, they're pretty much all done, with a few exceptions, via this particular dredge called the trailing suction hopper dredge. And so for this particular slide, I'm going to share with you kind of just the overall, I guess, operating components of these vessels. And then I'll share with you on the right what the bottom looks like after they're done dredging. So essentially, you can consider these vessels as almost like mobile vacuums, in the sense that they're large vessels. They have what we call this big hopper in the middle of them, so a compartment or a barge to store material. And you can see in the picture here, there's these two, what we call drag arms, that are lowered to the bottom, and they're essentially sucking sand off of that first 2 feet or so of the bottom. So imagine a vessel moving at about 1 to 3 knots, sucking material off the bottom, generally about 2 feet thicknesses with each pass, and all that sediment goes into this hopper or this dredge. And once they fill the hopper or reach the limit of what they can hold, they then move and pump it out to a nearby placement location. So wherever they're doing the beach nourishment, they bring that sediment to, and then pump it out like I showed in the picture prior.
So Doug, you've got a floating boat that's floating around, sucking with a giant, not a giant, but you got a vacuum cleaner coming out the bottom, sucking up sand and then pumping it ashore.
That's exactly
what
right.
we're looking at. Okay, got it.
Yep. And then on the right, you can see kind of on the picture to the left here, where you can see where these passes along the bottom have occurred. So the pictures on the top there show you an image after the dredging occurred, and you can see these kind of ridges along the bottom. And then this bottom graphic shows you kind of a cross section. Obviously, it's a vertical exaggeration there, but essentially after the vessel has extracted the sediment, at least behind this kind of extraction area where there's a certain volume of sand that's been removed, and it gives you a sense of kind of how these vessels operate offshore. So again, in summary, they're these mobile vessels. They're moving offshore when they're dredging at roughly 1 to 3 knots. And while they're moving, they've got these drag arms on the bottom, and they're essentially sucking sediment roughly at about a 2-foot thickness per pass. All that material goes into the dredge, and then once they're full, they mobilize and pump it out. Next slide, please. So here's getting to kind of more of the details now. So dating back to around the 80s was the first time we realized some of the constraints or concerns regarding dredging, specifically with a trailing suction hopper dredge, and potential impacts to sea turtles. And specifically, these animals can be sucked through these dredges and either injured or killed. And so one of the things that we have been looking at is how to reduce that risk. And so in this particular slide, what I wanted to share is kind of a little more close-up view via the schematic of that drag arm as it's moving along the bottom. And you can play the video here. As that kind of drag arm is moving, like I said earlier, on the bottom, roughly about, let's just say 1 to 3 knots, we have to think about kind of what these sea turtles may be doing in the path of this vessel. And so this video is similar to the data sets that have been provided in this challenge. And what it does is it provides you kind of the general behavior patterns that these animals exhibit, and how that may relate to this encountering dredge. And so one thing I want to mention in this figure here is that these dredges are really focused on the bottom. So this drag arm is not sucking water throughout the water column. The pumps don't turn on until that interface happens right at the bottom. So as you saw in that video, these sea turtles, depending on kind of time of year and animal and location, they do exhibit this kind of movement throughout the water column that doesn't necessarily always include them sitting on the bottom. So that risk, if you want to call it, in terms of where this draghead may encounter a turtle, is really focused on the bottom.
So, Doug, I'm just going to interrupt you again because that's kind of what I do. So we've got the suction cup going, the suction of the dredge going through the water, but it's designed that if an animal's not on the seafloor, can you explain that again? What happens if an animal's not resting?
Yeah, so the operation of these pumps, they only turn them on when that drag head is sitting on the bottom. So you can imagine that suction field, and it's kind of shown through these arrows in the graphic. Imagine that suction field being confined right to kind of that sediment interface. And so if you think about where the potential impact could be to these animals in the water, it's really when they're on that bottom. As you can see in this video and this graphic now, it's like as that animal is coming up into the water column, well, the risk of it being captured by this drag head is slim to none, because there's just no suction field up there. So as it spends time on the bottom is really kind of where that interface of concern is that we have. Next slide, please. And I should mention too that like I said earlier, that data set that I just showed in that video snippet, similar data is what we've provided in this challenge. So when we first started recognizing this potential impact or direct impact to sea turtles in the 80s and 90s, there was a lot of investment of money, time, and engineering to kind of make some modifications to these equipment to minimize that potential chance encounter. And so I mentioned earlier that risk is right when those animals are on the bottom and this drag head is moving along. Long story short, engineers and scientists came together to figure out what potential engineering modifications could be done to these dredges to kind of really reduce this chance encounter. And so it's a combination of what I described earlier as operating conditions. So only operating the pumps when that drag head is on the bottom, so there's no suction field throughout the water column. And then we coupled that with engineering modifications. So this red kind of color here on the drag head is what we call a sea turtle deflecting drag head. And essentially it's kind of welded I-beams in front of the drag head, and it's fixed similar to kind of a cow catcher on a train, like this picture I have in the upper left, where the idea is we keep that drag head on the bottom and we plow the sediment as the dredge moves forward, so that if there are sea turtles in the area, theoretically they would get captured into this sediment plume and pushed away and not pulled into the suction field. So the purpose of this slide is to kind of communicate years back, again in the 80s and 90s, these engineering modifications that were implemented that we still include in contracts today. So these sea turtle deflecting drag heads are included in most, if not all, sea turtle US dredging operations. And so this was one measure or engineering modification that was developed and proven to be relatively successful and is still implemented today. So going on 30 or so years, we've been using this measure. However, there still is a chance that we can take or capture sea turtles in the dredge, even with this modification. But one thing I did want to share is when this method was developed, it was heavily studied, heavily engineered in labs, in the field, and quantitatively and qualitatively evaluated. So large investment, ultimately, both in kind of the field and the lab side. Next slide. And so this next slide brings us to sea turtle relocation trawling. So I mentioned this history of how we got to designing actual physical modifications to the drag head to reduce the potential impact to sea turtles. But even with that measure in place, we still have turtles that can potentially be killed by these operations. Around the 90s, 2000s, the idea of capturing sea turtles with a trawler to potentially move them out of the way began to be added or considered as an additional measure to put on these projects to try to further kind of remove this risk of encounter of sea turtles. It was first kind of implemented as a tool to kind of assess what the abundance of turtles were in a certain project area, not necessarily to move them out of the way, but just to kind of before the project starts, get a feel for whether there are turtles in the area. But over time, we kind of continued this practice in a manner that's more for the purpose of moving them theoretically out of the project area and hopefully out of harm's way from the dredge. You can see in the picture in the upper left is an example of sitting in the wheelhouse of one of these hopper dredges looking forward. And in the distance, you see this trawler just ahead of the dredge. Theoretically, like I said, in the graphic in the upper right, you can see moving this trawler through the water column to hopefully move animals out of the way. These vessels don't always stay in front of the dredge for obvious reasons and safety risk. So essentially, the trawlers are moving ahead of and in and around the area that the dredge will be operating. The graphic on the left is another picture, which is essentially just a modified shrimp trawler. And then on the right is a picture of a turtle that was captured, brought on the vessel, and they're in the process of moving that turtle several miles away from where the dredge was operating. So again, this tool, if you want to call it that, of relocation trawling was essentially initiated as just an approach to kind of see what the abundance was in a project before the dredging occurred. But over time, it started being built in as a mitigation tool to move sea turtles out of harm's way. Next slide, please. So in terms of specifications, and I should say, kind of going on from that prior slide, though there was some investment of science and engineering in terms of thinking through the net design and the trawl operation in terms of duration to remove the potential drowning risk to some of these animals, there was definitely a lot of thought in terms of how we can modify a traditional shrimp trawler in a safe way to capture these animals and move them. But it wasn't a very thoughtful kind of quantitative approach to how we can design these net specs or operating components in a way that mitigates this risk in a comparable way to how much investment was made into the engineering side of the house. So it was kind of an idea that was then carried forward without much research in terms of how effective it really is as a tool. So in this slide, what I wanted to show, and if you could hit the graphic or the video link again, this is similar to kind of how I communicated the dredge moving along the bottom. Imagine this net moving along the bottom, and I show the scale of that net, about a 15-foot high by 35-foot high swath of water it's covering. And again, you still have these behaviors of the sea turtles that are kind of either within or not within the path of this trawler moving. So in terms of how effective these nets are in physically removing animals from the area that would have otherwise potentially been impacted by the dredge, hasn't actually really been quantified. We've just basically been moving this mitigative tool into practice without having really the science behind it to show its effectiveness. So for the purpose of this slide, it's kind of showing you the dimensions of this net. This is just an example that I found online. You can find more online. And by the way, all the dredging operations, if you want to get more information on trailing suction hopper dredges and how they work, if you just search online, you'll find plenty of videos that give you more information if you're interested. But again, this is sometimes these trawlers will tow 2 of these nets. So assume, a volume of water moving through about 15 feet up into the water column from the bottom, and roughly 2 nets at about 35 feet wide. So they're moving through ahead of or in and around a dredge, and sometimes there's two trawlers operating if there are two dredges. So for every dredge, there's typically one trawler. Next slide, please. So what are we looking for in this challenge? In that prior slide, I discussed kind of what the specs are of these nets, and that the underlying purpose is to try to capture sea turtles and move them theoretically out of the potential way of that incoming drag head. We've learned over the years, though, that it's very possible we're catching turtles that may not have actually been impacted by the drag head. So as I mentioned in that earlier slide, that real area of concern is in that kind of first meter or so of that water column where the drag head is interfaced with the sediment. And if that turtle is there, that's the area of concern. Now, if the trawler is moving through the water and those turtles would have never spent time on the bottom otherwise, we're physically moving these animals out of the water, putting them on the vessel and moving them into an area several miles away. And it's possible those animals may not have even been at risk of being impacted by the trawler. So in terms of what we're trying to understand, it's how many of these animals, based on what we know about their movement patterns in the water column and what we know about the net specifications of a trawler and the tow speed and duration, how many do we think that could have been at risk or captured, or even the non-at-risk turtles in terms of them being captured and moved? And based on that information, really start to ask ourselves, what is the effectiveness of this operation as it's currently spec'd out? And then are there things that we could be doing in terms of net changes or new designs or operating components that could improve the effectiveness? While at the same time, we realize that there's also other animals that could potentially be captured by this relocation trawling operation and potentially be impacted I guess indirectly from our underlying goal here. So is there a way that we can execute this operation where we're moving the target animals in a more effective way while not impacting other animals via what we call bycatch? Also, as we think through kind of a more quantitative understanding of how effective this operation is, are there things that we could be collecting in terms of other data that could help us kind of bolster confidence in kind of the effectiveness? And so as you think about this question and this challenge, what other things should we maybe be thinking about to help us understand this question? And this final bullet, again, are there modifications that could be made? And I would say that for the last 20 plus years that this type of tool has been implemented, there's been very little kind of investment of time and energy in evaluating whether the current design and operating components of relocation trawling are effective at all. So this is really the first time we've asked this question: how do we think through sea turtle behavior and kind of their movements in the water in the context of the trawl operation, and what can we do to improve it, or is it not worth the investment of time in moving these animals? Next slide, please. So what can you do to cause a breakthrough? And obviously a lot of this is laid out in the guidelines on the website, but really what we're looking for are kind of out of the box analytic tools or visualizations based on the data that we provided. Are there ways to look at this that can really help us make better decisions? We obviously don't want to be putting relocation trawling requirements on a project if the risk of the dredge impacting those sea turtles wasn't, I guess, as risky as maybe even the trawling operation in itself, right? So if the trawler is moving through the water column and the rate of capture and relocation just doesn't really keep up with the number of animals that are there, and it's not making a difference, then we don't want to impact either the sea turtles or other bycatch if it's not proven to be effective to remove their risk from the dredge itself. In terms of the data that we're providing, we've got sea turtle movement data. So there's data from 3 sea turtles in the Gulf of Mexico in the US and 8 sea turtles in the Atlantic coast of the US. And they have these tags on them that give us a lot of information about their behavior and fine scale movement, similar to what I shared in those videos. So the data give you that kind of representation of their swimming behavior, their resting behavior, their diving behaviors. And we can look at that kind of example data set and apply it to what we know about the trawling operations and begin to maybe generate some scenarios or ideas as to, if there were 100 turtles in an area with this trawler moving based on the behavior patterns that we're showing in these data sets, what is the rate of catch? And is it effective in moving these turtles from potentially the dredge operation? We've also provided example data sets in terms of what's been reported for actual projects from the relocation trawling operation. So where were turtles captured and relocated? What were some of the other bycatch? Also, what were the boundaries that the trawler was working in and where the dredge was operating? So there's the sea turtle movement data. There's data related to the trawling operation for a real project that happened in the Gulf of Mexico, specifically within an actual dredge area. We call those areas borrow areas, but the area for which the dredge is allowed to remove sediment, we provided that information. And then there's also dredge information for that same project. So where was the dredge drag arm located over time throughout that same area? And then there's also the opportunity, those are the primary data sets, but there's also opportunity to integrate other environmental and oceanographic data that are deemed relevant for the purpose of this challenge. So at the end of the day, what we're really looking for is your insight and your creative thinking and your innovative approaches based on the information that we've shared to help us kind of better understand this operation of relocation trawling, specifically its effectiveness, and whether there are opportunities to improve it that haven't been considered in the past. And I think really any idea is a good idea because frankly, it hasn't really been explored to the level that it should have. So we're really excited about getting insight and ideas from anybody and everybody that's interested in this challenge. And with that, I think I've kind of concluded the details of this chat and open for questions. But Jake, I know you like to kind of rein me in for a little more easy language.
Can we go back to that slide for a second? Because I think it's pretty amazing. If we can just go back one slide. We have an amazing amount of information here, right? So if you, the amount of information that you go one forward though, just the last slide Doug covered. If we have an amazing amount of information that available right now, right? So we basically know all the stuff that's happening in this area, where the turtle is and how they move, even as fine of a thing as are they resting on the bottom versus are they swimming, what direction they're pointed. There's all sorts of information that we have on turtle movement. We know where the dredge net or where the dredge was, and we know all sorts of oceanographic conditions. What we want is someone that, if I understand this correctly, Doug, is someone that can put all this information together and show us sort of like a game of Frogger almost of, instead of a frog going across the traffic lane, it would be a sea turtle. And what are the chances that sea turtle is going to get not hit by a car, but scooped up in a net or otherwise relocated, right?
Exactly. And I'm glad you brought that up because, I mentioned this historic period in which we've been executing these types of projects and these types of activities like relocation trawling. The amount of technology improvement over that time span is impressive. And so the fact that we have data now showing us the fine scale behavior of these sea turtles to the point where we can create these kind of little videos showing their actual movements through the water column, those are data sets that we just did not have 20 years ago. And also in terms of the dredge operation, we have data that show exactly where that drag head is at any point in time and the density of the material coming through it, whether it's water or sand. I mean, there's so much data now and technology that can inform what we know about the effectiveness of some of these tools. And the last thing, like I said, the last thing we want, I mean, my job is to analyze the environmental impacts of these activities. If I'm analyzing the dredging impacts and saying there's this risk to sea turtles, and to avoid that potential impact, I'm going to put this trawler out there. Well, I better know that that trawler is not having a greater impact than the dredge itself. And so the fact that we've been putting these trawls out there under the idea that, you know, they're removing animals from potential harm's way, I mean, that's great, but we really need to move forward in terms of kind of quantifying that, really wrapping our hands around whether it really is the tool that we think it is. And frankly, if it's not, or if there's ways to improve it, we absolutely want to know what those are. So if there's a follow-on effort from this study where we can say, hey, look, you know, we ran this challenge and we had some really smart people from all over the world share some ideas, and they think that if we did a modified net design and operation of this trawler in a way that looks like this, we could potentially increase our catch rate by whatever it may be, and perhaps that improves our ability to reduce risk. So I think, like I said, there's room for any idea here. I think there's a lot of data that can be considered. We've got great, the technology has increased significantly to where we have an opportunity now to really answer some questions here that we never asked over the last 20 years. So yeah, Jake, hopefully that little chat between you and I maybe elaborates a little more on what we're looking for here.
Yeah, for sure. So now do we open it up for questions if people want to ask questions about what we're looking for?
Absolutely. We would love to take questions from the audience. If you do have a question, there's a Q&A box down at the bottom of the screen. Please feel free to just drop your question in there. We'll do our best to answer questions live, but if there's anything we don't know the answer to in this session, we'll do our best to come back to you with an answer. So the first question I have here is on turtle behavior. Is there any information whether turtles swim or rest on the ocean floor in groups or clusters, or rather do they swim independently?
Jake, do you want to be the first to try, and then I'll chime in? You're on mute.
Sorry. Yeah, sure. It's a good question. I think it depends on what's going on. I think that turtles will gather in similar areas because of food availability or other things happening. They don't like school like fish do, but they also have, you know, social behaviors that you know, in their life that they'll come together to do. So obviously, you know, to find a mate or for nesting during nesting season. So, but do they gather together in the water, like schooling together in big herds, or whatever a group of turtles is called? No, I don't think so. But Doug, go ahead. What were you going to say?
Yeah, no, so I think it's a good question, and I think for the sake of this challenge, you know, I keep mentioning how, you know, we've had so much innovation over the last 20 years in terms of our tagging technology and our ability to track these animals and see what they're doing. Even though we've had so much innovation, we've learned so much, we still have a lot of unknowns. And I think for the sake of this challenge, though, what we've tried to do is package some real data sets on real turtles and that fine scale behavior that represents kind of different behavior patterns. So for the sake of the challenge, you can assume that we've captured kind of a swimming behavior or a resting behavior or a diving behavior. I don't have a problem in terms of the challenge if somebody then says, if there was a group of turtles that did similar resting behavior over some duration of time, this is what the effectiveness of relocation trawling could be. And making, whether it's a true assumption or not, frankly, for the sake of the challenge, I'm not as concerned about. But getting to the actual question, I think what we've shared is representative behavior patterns and kind of what assumptions a person doing the challenge wants to make, whether they're true biologically speaking or not. We can screen that out later.
Great, thank you so much, Doug and Jake. My next question is, do we need to know ODBA from the IMU data? And maybe you can also define those terms for any folks that haven't dug into the data just yet.
So if the person, if I understand that correctly, we're talking about the overall dynamic body acceleration of animals. And IMU would be inertial measurement unit or inertial measurement sensor, which is how you would get that kind of data. I was just starting to type a reply to that in the chat here. It's a good question. I don't think you need to know that. I don't think you need to go into that depth on the inertial measurement data. You know, the energetics and all that stuff isn't really what we're looking for. That's certainly of interest, but rather the position of where the animal is and how the animal is oriented, if you wanted to use that sort of fine scale data. So I feel like, you know, again, you know, however you want to go about analyzing the data is fine. But I think that, you know, calculating ODBA from all that code in there, that's going to be a lot to do. And I'm not sure, you know, I think what I would focus more on is the position of the animal and the animal's orientation in the water compared to everything else.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, the next question I have is if you can speak towards what you're looking for in a winning solution. Obviously, we know, we're looking for this tool to help us understand whether turtles are at risk, if this is effective. What are some of the qualities that you're looking for in a winning solution?
Yeah, I'll start on this one, Jake. You can follow up. I mean, I'm open for anything, but I mentioned earlier that, you know, we had, it's really, when I think about the drag head deflector and the engineering solutions that went into that and kind of the physical models and all the things that we did, it was really founded on science. And I think in this case, what we're trying to do is get some sense of this effectiveness of this tool, but visually, I think visualizations are really powerful. You know, at some point there's an opportunity, we could always take what we learned from this challenge and do an actual field effort where we're looking, you know, in the water and we've got cameras and we've got, you know, real trawler operating. I mean, that's a whole other piece of this that could be executed. But I think at this point, we're really trying to figure out what kind of ideas might be out there in terms of ways we should look at this that maybe we hadn't even thought about before. So I think completely out of the box ideas are certainly interesting, but still obviously reined into the fundamental question we have here. But yeah, whether it be a net modification or like Jake described, some scenario planning, some visualizations of if a turtle did X, then Y, or, you know, we use this Frogger reference a lot in terms of the old Atari game Frogger, but the idea of you know, if we know what that trawler is doing in the water, we know its dimensions of water that it's kind of capturing, what would these behavior patterns have to be for a certain catch rate? So anything like that, or kind of visual ways in which we can better understand kind of what the potential effectiveness or improvements could be to this operation, that at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is have a win-win solution here where we can have these dredging operations and in a perfect world, zero chance of encountering turtles. And this is one of those tools we're using, but we just don't know whether we're doing it in the best way possible. So any ideas to help with that would be great. Jake, anything?
Yeah, I think, you know, there's it's kind of a blank slate. You can take this any direction, right? A visualization, a rendering, some statistics. I think that this is one of those things that's really ripe for data visualization and to even put together a visualization of how everything could work together, and then even to start informing things a little bit. We've never had anyone put all these data layers together, and so even just doing that could be a huge step in the right in the right direction here to help us quantify this.
Awesome. Thank you so much for both of those answers. And I'll just add for anyone not familiar with the challenge guidelines to make sure you read through those closely 2 or 3 times. Spent a lot of time prior to launching this challenge with Doug and Jake and the BOEM team, kind of teasing out what some of those success criteria are as well. So that's another great place you can go look. I have another question here on data. Do you have AIS data from trawl vessels?
Oh, that's a great question.
It-
Do we?
So we didn't provide it. No, it should be. I mean, certainly they're running AIS when they're out there. But I don't think we provided the specific location information for each trawl in the data set. I'd have to look. I think it's more about the capture location of where the turtles were, and you could make some assumptions in terms of the start stop and their speed for the path and all that. But we didn't provide the actual transit location for the vessels that we provided.
So I assume if somebody's asking about AIS data, they want to gather vessel speed from that. Can people assume a standard vessel speed for this?
Yeah, we put that in. I think there's an assumed 1 to 3 knots.
Okay.
I can't remember, but it is in the challenge guidelines, the assumed speed. And those are pretty hard and fast rules. Obviously, for the folks who do these types of operations, there's obvious reasons you can't go faster. And so I think we can make some assumptions, and we did in the guidelines. For the sake of this challenge, in the absence of having the specifics of AIS data for the vessels, we're okay with just using the assumptions we've provided.
That's awesome.
That sounds great. Thanks, Doug. And I just found those assumptions in the guidelines. So it's 2 to 3 knots can be your assumption for how fast the trawlers are moving. Maybe going from this question, could you talk a little bit about some of the other assumptions that we've shared about the challenge? And if you'd like me to screen share that on the challenge guidelines, I'm happy to as well.
Yeah, I think the screen share would be helpful, and then I could talk through it. Yeah, and so folks, if you hadn't seen the challenge guidelines, some of these assumptions are outlined there. Yeah, so we talked already about, for the trawling, the typical operational speeds, the total minutes that the trawler is in the water, so nets in and nets out duration is 42 minutes, and that's hard and fast based on the obvious risk of potential animals drowning and other impacts. So those parameters are important assumptions, and for the data that we provided in terms of the trawling data, they would have followed those specific assumptions as well. The net span I showed in the slide, obviously there's some variability here, but in general, we should assume about a 15-foot height in the net dimension and about a 30-foot wide. And again, assuming that a trawler could operate 2 nets. So you can calculate obviously a 70-foot wide kind of swath coverage of that trawl net. In terms of the sea turtles and trailing suction drag heads, like I mentioned earlier, the operational components in the US for when there's a risk of turtles in the area, there's very clear requirements in terms of how these dredges are supposed to operate, and that includes keeping them on bottom. It typically includes having the deflector on the dredge, and it typically includes the operation of that drag arm in a way that's conducive for that deflector to be plowing sediment. So those are some assumptions that should be made, that the operation of these drag arms would only have pumps on when they're on the bottom. And then another good assumption here is the size of these drag heads. They are large and range in size from 10 to 16 feet in width, depending on the dredge that's operating. And I mentioned earlier, the cut thickness is typically in upwards of about 2 feet per pass. And then we have here the site. We provided, in terms of the data we provided the boundaries of an actual borrow area or dredge area in the Gulf of Mexico, for which the trawler data that we provided was operating. The data that we provided for the turtles are not specifically in the area where the trawling and the dredge data were that we provided, but that's perfectly fine. We're providing those data sets as a means to kind of give you the general behavior patterns that could be applied. I don't think we need to get too into the weeds on, we all know that, the size class and the species and the location and the time of year will cause these behavior patterns to vary, but I think it's okay to just assume that these are representations of certain behavior patterns that could be applied to this particular analysis. And I think there's a couple other things here on depth. I don't know if I'll get into all the details, but I think I've hit most of the assumptions here, Kyla.
Awesome. Thank you so much for talking through those. I find it, for me, helpful to kind of understand the big picture to talk through some of those assumptions.
Yeah, and I would say that, I mean, I know this is a lot of information, and for somebody that's maybe not, an expert in this type of business, or even in turtles for that matter, maybe they don't have experience in that there might be some more questions that come up as you're looking through these data. I know Jake and I are certainly willing, working with Kyla and the rest of the team, to field questions as they come in, because we certainly want folks to have all of their questions answered so that we can get the best submission possible.
Absolutely. And we only have a few minutes left, so I'd like to just walk through the challenge website really briefly for folks. Let me share my screen. Hopefully you're now seeing it. Great. So this is the challenge website. Everything you need to know is on here. We've referenced the guidelines a number of times. That's in this section. It includes those assumptions, judging criteria, all of those important details. The other section I'd like to point everyone to is the resources section, and there's lots of valuable content here. The data package is available in the resources section, either as a direct download link here in a zip file or a Google Drive folder if you'd like to access it uncompressed. There's also this data walkthrough, which is something I'd recommend watching, that just kind of talks through the data, the structure of the data in the folders, all of that good stuff. And then we've included a number of articles, and these are by no means required reading or something you need to dig into, but we wanted to share some things that we thought might be helpful for you as you're looking to put together your solution. So we have a number of articles here, and then below these articles, we also have some other details like video of a sea turtle behavior and trawling net specifications and an image of a shrimp trawl net. Doug or Jake, was there anything you wanted to mention about the resources that I haven't already?
I don't think so.
No? Awesome. Nope. All right. So this is also where you will submit your submission. If you haven't registered, you'll see a Solve Challenge Here button first, but after you click that, you can go in and see the submission form. So I recommend opening this up well in advance so you know exactly what questions you're going to need to answer and can fill in the data here. So there are a few text-based submission forms in addition to your solution file. You can create a draft of your submission form, save it, and come back to it at any time prior to the submission deadline, which is on December 15th. Okay, we have just a few minutes left if there's any other burning questions. Otherwise, perhaps to close off the Q&A, I'll just ask both you, Doug and Jake, what guidance do you have for competitors? Is there anything you'd recommend folks keep in mind as they leave this webinar and start to dig into the data?
I'd say nothing's off the table. I think that you have a lot of great information in front of you. I would say however you think you could best creatively address the issue that helps advance, take one step forward is great. And I wouldn't get hung up on the prettiest visualization in the world or things like that. I would say let's advance the answers to those questions even just a fraction of a step.
Yeah, and with that said, I do, Jake mentioned it doesn't have to be the fanciest visualization, but I do think it's important for kind of the judges and in relation to the criteria to still have kind of a visualization piece. And if it's some complex data kind of analysis, there's still a means to kind of translate understanding via some visual kind of tools, because ultimately we really want to take what we get out of this challenge and apply it. I mean, that's the exciting part about this particular challenge is myself and my colleagues that proposed this challenge. We need this information for like an actual dredging project and to help inform an actual decision. So, you know, your investment of time here, if you're a winner, ultimately we could be taking that into the field and maybe moving this practice of mitigating risk from these projects in a forward step, which I'm excited about, because like I said earlier, you know, these measures that we're currently practicing are 20 plus years old. So what comes out of this could lead us into kind of the future innovation of how we kind of further reduce these chance encounters with sea turtles. And one last thing, Kyla, I didn't, on the last slide, I did have my email and phone number and things like that. So I don't know if that's kind of how we want to handle future questions, but I suppose it would just go through the website on HeroX, right?
Yeah, so on the HeroX website, there is a challenge forum. So you can post any questions that you have there. I'll be monitoring the forum and making sure Doug and Jake get their eyes on questions that need answered as they come in. So that's the best place for any follow-on. There are two last questions that just came in the Q&A. Maybe we'll touch on those very quickly before the top of the hour. And they're both about calculating potential catch rate. So the first is, do we have data for the length and width of migratory channels as well as migration numbers?
Jake, do you want to start?
Say again, do we have data for the length and width of boy, that's tough. It's not like a shipping channel, right? You know, I think of it more like a corridor that, you know, like if you're flying across the United States, you could be anywhere in that sort of corridor, but you're not. You could be, you know, at any altitude, and you could be at any, you know, you might be over in Nebraska, or you might be over South Dakota, depending on whatever day you're doing this. So I think that getting to the length and width is going to be tough, right? Because that's a huge area.
Yeah, I think we could make some assumptions. Obviously, we're giving you the spatial footprint of the borrow area or the dredge area. That gives you kind of an acreage footprint of where to focus. Obviously, dredging occurs in navigation channels and things like that as well, which have certain boundaries in terms of width, and you can make some assumptions about turtle numbers in those boundaries. Specific like corridors and migration paths, no, you know, I agree with Jake, but you know, I know the data set we provided was specific to an area in the Gulf called Ship Shoal, and you know, there was a large number of turtles in excess of several hundred that were captured and relocated as a part of that particular project and that location that we provided in terms of the borrow location. So I think it's okay to just make some assumptions around total numbers. We put a number in the guidelines, I think, of assuming about a number of 50 or so turtles in any analysis. But like I said, we're open. You know, if somebody has some scenarios that they're presenting and says, you know, if there are 2 turtles in this acreage of area, then your catch rate is 0 or whatever. However, if you add 500 and they're doing this behavior over that timeline, your catch rate would change in this way. I personally am not as much concerned about whether it's a realistic number that could be assumed in the location as I am about what it would take to get certain catch rates. So I don't know if that helps answer that question, but hopefully that's informative.
Yeah. One thing I got from that is just document your assumptions in the submission form. So you will probably need to make more than what we've provided and just document what those are. Okay, we have one last question. Doug and Jake, do you have an extra minute to answer this last one, or do you have a hard stop? You do? Okay, great. To calculate catch rate, are you looking for something like calculating if you're walking in the rain, will you get wetter by walking or running?
That's a great question. You know, will you get wetter by walking or running is a factor of exposure, right? Of are you exposed to water more or less to the same rate of water falling? I think that it's a similar analogy here when we're looking at likelihood. And that sort of seems like it's scratching the surface of the right way to think about this, of taking the turtle behavioral speed or the turtle behavior movement through an area. Does that increase or decrease its exposure to the trawling net, and increase the likelihood it's going to get captured or decrease the likelihood it's going to get captured? So in a way, in a roundabout weird way, yes, but it's kind of it's a good analogy to how to think about the problem.
Yeah, I don't have anything more to add other than I think it, in terms of the assumptions about trawl speed and things like that, I think we do need to kind of stick with those, because I think an increased trawl speed, starts to have the impacts on the animals. I mean, we keep saying any idea is a good idea. I think as long as you're documenting your assumptions, like Kyla said, then that's fine. I don't have anything more really to add though than what you just described, Jake. It seems reasonable.
Yeah, I think if we're talking about exposure risk, if it's me walking in the rain slowly versus me walking in the rain quickly, so I think of that like a turtle moving through an area at one speed versus another speed, and a trawl that's moving at a known speed. What is the likelihood of that? That seems pretty similar to me.
Yeah.
Awesome. Cool analogy. Great question.
Yeah, great question.
All right. Well, we are at time. So thank you again for everyone joining us. We are more than happy to answer questions as they come in. So please don't hesitate to reach out. And like I said, the forum on the challenge page is the best place to go. If you're not already registered on the challenge page, please do so. It will just take you a moment, and that way you'll be sure to get notifications like the recording from this webinar and any other helpful information that we're able to share with the community as a whole. So with that, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you again, Doug and Jake. Great job today, and such a pleasure working on this project with you. We look forward to everyone's submissions.
Thanks.
Thank you.